have to train ourselves to be able to talk about everything, because we constantly change our worldview. And sometimes we improve it, sometimes it goes quite opposite. But the point is, the more you think about why you think about those things, the better understand your own process of thinking. When I came to America about 12 years ago, I hugely admired Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was an atheist, and I love his ideas. I read almost all his books. I watched his lectures, his talks that he gave, and I was incredibly fascinated with this man. And I learned a lot from him. But then, on a certain point, later on, I discovered Jordan Peterson, and suddenly I changed my views on religion. And Jordan Peterson gave me different argument that I loved and that I could adjust to my life, because when I didn't believe in God, when I was reading Christopher Hitchens, his argument wasn't sufficient as Jordan Peterson argument, because Jordan Peterson argument helped me to discover something that I could apply to my life and increase my well-being through this argument. It's very important to be open to new ideas, and sometimes you have no idea where help might come. Because if something is wrong with you, if something makes you miserable, or you have this cognitive dissonance when you try to hold several ideas, and even worse, try to hide certain ideas from yourself, you have to look for solution, and you have to learn to talk about this stuff. Jordan Peterson said that if you wanna think, you have to be ready to get offensive, because some people will get offended if your worldview doesn't disalign with their worldview. And I have my own subjective experience, and I have my own idea of reality. And I try to understand other people's subjective experience as well, but it doesn't mean I'm always right. I think I'm mostly wrong. That's why I constantly look and constantly educating myself on this matter. I slowly discovering great thinkers like Thomas Sowell or Godsat or Jordan Peterson, as I already said, or many others who I keep reading and understanding their worldview. The same as Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, that I'm incredibly critical right now, but before I admired deeply. And you always change your positions. You always try to understand and try to adapt new way of seeing the world. And if something bothers you, if something doesn't give you a chance to rest, you shouldn't shut this thought. You shouldn't put it away, because it's still gonna be there. You have to make a peace with this thought. Otherwise, if you refuse to acknowledge this thought, you would give this thought a power over you, and it would take over your intellectual capacity to understand this thought properly, because we're afraid of something we refuse to understand, we refuse to acknowledge, because once you acknowledge something, it stops having power over you. It's like with addiction. If you have an urge that you want to satisfy badly, if you try to fight this urge, in most cases you're gonna lose it. What you do is you let it pass through you. You acknowledge the urge, you just don't act upon this urge. You just, okay, go ahead, go through me, I don't care. I know that you're here, I know that I wanted this, but I'm not gonna act, whatever. And this urge suddenly losing all this grip upon you and slowly dissipate. That's how you battle addictions. In the same way you battle this thought, uncomfortable thought that keep bothering you, like thought about racism, for example, that a lot of people refuse to talk about. Or if somebody talk about it, they talk from position of authority. And usually their position of authority is just their emotional worldview, where they emotionally invented facts. through their emotions. Because facts don't care about your feelings. There's facts and there's your feelings. It's good to have feelings, but you cannot change with your feelings the facts. And it's happened to me a lot during my lifetime in America, because people like to group other people in certain groups. I always thought, isn't it bad when you attribute racism only one group of people? In some sense, this attribution is racism itself, because you attribute racism to such a group of people, and what you do is, with this attribution, you dehumanize this group of people by making them evil by definition. And once they're evil, you can do pretty much whatever you want with them, because all your action in some sense justifiable against this group of people. That's what my personal subjective experience was telling me. Because every time when I look at the news or social media, I see permanent people were bashing one group of people. Not individuals, but the entire group of people. And that's incredibly dangerous, because if you look at the history of the world, every time when somebody tried to single one group of people out, it never end well. It always end bad. And we have to be careful, because racism exists. Racism is real. But attribute racism to one group of people is insane. We have to attribute racism to certain individuals that behave in a racist manner. Because racism, in my opinion, is when you have this solid conviction that your skin color makes you superior just because of your skin color. That's it. Every other additions is just ideological indoctrinations to make some ideology that you can oppose on other people and silence other people. Because if you claim I'm not racist, you have to prove that you're not. It's funny about racism. If somebody claims that you're racist, it's actually the burden of proof not on the person who made a claim, the burden of proof on you, because somebody claimed that you're racist. That's what I like Christopher Hitchens, because he said whatever was asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And we have to learn to dismiss this stuff, because criticizing of Islam somehow makes you racist. And again, Richard Dawkins said, well, Islam is a religion. Islam is not a race. Everybody can convert and become a Muslim. Race is something that you cannot convert it to. You're just born into the certain skin color or into certain race. There's different things. You see, even believing in God, I still can't quote the greatest atheists like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, because you can't derive a lot of interesting information from them, and you always have to learn. You always have to understand yourself and your subjective experience, and you shouldn't afraid voice your concern, but you have to be careful and voice your concern in an intelligent manner. You have to learn to speak. You have to learn to speak about something, because you shouldn't lose your ground. You shouldn't fight. What you do, you should understand for yourself first. You should develop this firm ground under your feet that helps you to find the center of your own existence. Because the world is changing so rapidly, and a lot of people avoid talking about uncomfortable subjects. But we have to, otherwise we're losing this idea of freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is impossible if everybody around you afraid to exercise this freedom of speech. And then you have some people who just keep screaming profanities that make no sense, and therefore they in some sense undermine this idea of freedom of speech. Think about it carefully. If people with a common sense refuse to exercise their freedom of speech, and only people who incredibly mad and incredibly idiotic in their expression of freedom of speech that filled with profanities and hate speech, of course freedom of speech is going to lose all meaning. Because freedom of speech was designed for people with common sense. And of course for everybody else too. If you want to scream profanities, go ahead, scream profanities. If you want to insult me, go ahead, insult me. You're free to do so. If you want to practice some ideological insanities, go ahead, keep talking about it. But everybody else supposed to oppose all those insanities, all those ideological profanities with a reasonable freedom of speech, with a reasoning, because you have to reason. If you don't have reasoning underneath, or if you're afraid to voice common sense, if you're afraid to reason with people who's incredibly unreasonable, then you don't have freedom of speech. Then nothing is right. And then we have incredibly horrific cases of police brutalities, where police, for example, like in UK, when Henry Howard was stabbed several times, and his stabber called the police and tell them that he was racially insulted or something like this. When police came, they saw this boy lying stabbed on the ground, and they handcuffed him, who was dying, literally dying, who was telling them he cannot breathe, while the criminal who stabbed him was standing with the police and watching this boy dying. Because there's no common sense anymore. There's no common sense, because when the police came, they have this DI training that messed up their understanding of reality, and when they don't trust anymore their subjective experience, and they handcuffed the victim who was dying from stabbing wounds, who was bleeding on the ground, while the perpetrator with the knife was standing with them, making wild claim about racism. Racism is real, but we lost the point, because we should trust our own eyes. And if we don't, the civilization would collapse. I noticed this many times when people proudly, because listen, we have certain biases, but to have biases are normal, because that's how it helps us to survive. Racism is just extreme of your own biases when you become extreme and brainwashed by such an ideology that help you to become superior without doing anything. But biases themselves are normal, because you have to profile people for yourself, for your own survival. You have to understand, because your brain categorizes people constantly. And I understand this, and I always tell people, I know you trust me less because of my accent, because there's in-group and out-group preferences. I understand this. There's nothing wrong with that. I just have to be extra polite. If I want to be friends with somebody, I'll try to be extra polite to this person, because I know he or she would trust me less because of my accent. It's just how our brains work. There's nothing wrong with this. There's no racism in that. Racism is extreme form of bias. Extreme, but not many people go that far. But what happened is we went through different direction. Now we shouldn't trust our biases at all, and we should somehow prevent our brains from categorizing things. And then what happened is the police in UK came and see a dying man, and they cuffed this man up, and he died. Because they stopped trusting their own biases. They stopped trusting their own subjective experience. They stopped trusting common sense. And once you do, everything is gone. How are you supposed to live? How are you supposed to survive in the world like that, when black is white and white is black and nothing else matters? Because you're supposed to identify problem, but you cannot identify problem if you do not trust yourself, because you're the one who identify this problem. Because if you don't trust your own eyes, who are you supposed to trust? You're supposed to trust your own eyes, but to be able to trust your own eyes, you have to be reasonable enough and to trust your own reasoning. Otherwise, nothing makes sense. I wrote something today, this little sentence that I have to be brave enough to learn to be wrong. Otherwise, I'd never be right.